There's an image that keeps returning, obsessive, like a ghost of modernity. Cities rising ever higher, smoke darkening the sky, factories devouring lives and bodies. Where many see the triumph of humankind, a clear, unsparing eye saw only the abyss. It's the late 19th century. Europe celebrates the power of machines. Newspapers speak of progress. Science seems to have replaced God, and technology promises a radiant future. Amid that enthusiastic chorus, a solitary voice rises to say that behind the race there is no liberation but a deception. A lie that seduces with the promise of a better world, while in reality it corrodes the very substance of human life. Leo Tolstoy was not just a novelist. He was a man who had the courage to look his age in the face and call it by its real name. While others celebrated the marvels of industry, he walked the dirty alleys of Moscow and St. Petersburg, watched the tired faces of workers, heard the deafening roar of machines that turned individuals into cogs. There, he saw alienation, misery, disorientation, and he grasped something that still weighs like a sentence today. Technical progress does not coincide with human progress. Modernity taught how to build locomotives, light up cities, connect entire continents, but it did not teach how to love more. It did not teach how to live in peace, and above all, it did not teach how to recognize another person's dignity. The lie of progress lies precisely here, believing that improving material conditions is enough to make human beings better. Tolstoy put it plainly: everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. What he saw in industrial cities was not freedom, but imprisonment. Men and women who once worked the land, following natural cycles with a sense of belonging and community, had become numbers in a ledger, interchangeable hands serving a mechanism that consumed them day after day. The artisan's complete gesture was gone, choosing materials, shaping with one's own hands, watching the work come to life. In its place stood the blind repetition of a single movement, 100, 1,000 times a day, until any sense of self was lost. Tolstoy did not watch these transformations from an ivory tower. He was an aristocrat, but he lived among peasants. He knew the hardness of the soil and the sweat of manual labor. That double condition allowed him to see both faces of modernity. On one side, the elite salons celebrating a shining future. On the other, the misery of the masses paying the price of that promise. In that contradiction, his rebellion took shape. But that wasn't all. The deception wasn't only in the factories. It seeped into education too, turned into a system for producing obedient workers and passive consumers. Children, instead of growing with the curiosity and creativity typical of childhood, were trained to repeat facts, to accept authority without questions, to live in a paper world rather than the real one. Tolstoy even founded an experimental school for peasants, convinced that genuine education wasn't built on punishments and rigid curricula, but on living experience, manual work, observing nature, and community life. In that school, kids learned because they wanted to learn, not because they were forced. There, knowledge returned to being a vital act, not a drill. The same held for art. Tolstoy bristled at culture reduced to an elite pastime, made to entertain bored aristocrats and to separate rather than unite. For him, art had to speak to the heart of the peasant as much as to that of the noble. It had to unite, uplift, create authentic bonds. If a work couldn't be understood by anyone, then it wasn't true art, but a game of intellectual vanity. For this reason, too, he abandoned the complex style of his early novels and chose a simpler, more direct writing that could reach everyone. His criticism spared science either. Positivism, with its obsession with numbers, measurements, and formulas, had lost sight of the most urgent question: why live? Scientists could explain how the most sophisticated machines worked, but they couldn't say what makes life worth living. In the blind cult of technology, moral values, inner experiences, and the deepest feelings were dismissed as superstition. But Tolstoy saw clearly, without conscience, science is nothing but ruin of the soul. The core of his critique also struck at the issue of private property. He saw in the accumulation of wealth and the concentration of land in the hands of a few the poisoned root of every injustice. For him, the land could not belong to anyone. It was like air and water, a common good meant for all. Private property divided, crushed, and forced millions of people to depend on a handful of masters. From this came the idea of small, self-sufficient farming communities, founded on cooperation, free of exploitation and individual hoarding. It was not a naive dream. It was a model he had seen exist in real rural communities still bound by mutual aid. His condemnation of the state could not be missing either. Tolstoy defined it without hesitation: organized violence. Behind the facade of order and civilization, the state did nothing but protect the privileges of the rich with armies, police, and courts. It was a repressive machine that lived on coercion, and every law it passed served to defend the property of the powerful. This is why he arrived at a radical position, a Christian anarchism based on nonviolence and love, totally incompatible with any form of authority imposed from above. Religion itself did not escape his denunciation. The Orthodox Church, tied to the Tsarist state, had become an instrument of control, blessing wars and legitimizing oppression. In pompous rituals, Tolstoy saw no spirituality, only betrayal of the original gospel message. He sought instead a pure Christianity, made of simplicity, not dogma, of concrete life, not abstract theology. His faith translated into daily gestures, living modestly, working the land, serving others. "I cannot preach what I do not practice," he said. And so he gave up the privileges of aristocracy, distributed his wealth, dressed like a peasant, and chose voluntary poverty, because he understood that no sermon on justice could make sense if spoken by someone still living in luxury. True social transformation had to begin with individual transformation. Whoever does not change himself cannot change anything. The most radical principle he carried forward was nonviolence. Tolstoy understood that every act of violence, even when done with good intentions, ends up producing more violence. It is an endless cycle that devours entire generations. For him, passive resistance, civil disobedience, the refusal to take part in injustice, these were the only authentic weapons. These ideas would later inspire Gandhi and Martin Luther King, showing that nonviolence was not utopia, but a real force capable of changing the world. His literary work, From War and Peace to Anna Karenina, was never mere entertainment. It was an integral part of his mission, to reveal the contradictions of a corrupt society, to strip bare the vanity of the upper classes, to show how the pursuit of prestige and wealth leads only to emptiness and alienation. His characters were not decorative masks, but moral experiments in which readers could see themselves. Through them, he taught that another way existed: simplicity, authenticity, real life. And there is one aspect that makes Tolstoy even more relevant today. He saw with clarity that the ruthless race for progress would lead to a global ecological crisis. He intuited that treating nature as an infinite reservoir to exploit meant condemning oneself to self-destruction. He saw that alienated labor would not produce happiness, but frustration and a sense of emptiness. He foresaw the manipulation of the masses through media, the use of culture as an instrument of power, the unchecked growth of inequality. Everything we live today was already in his denunciation. That is why his voice is not a relic of the past. Tolstoy reminds us that it is not enough to invent more powerful machines, create global networks, accumulate wealth. Without moral growth, without compassion, without an authentic sense of meaning, all this is not progress. It is only a frantic race into the void. His lesson is simple and radical at the same time. The transformation of the world begins with inner transformation. A just society cannot exist if the individuals who compose it remain corrupted by the thirst for power, money, and domination. Progress does not exist if one does not learn to live with fewer vices and more authenticity. In an age like ours, obsessed with speed, efficiency, and infinite growth, Tolstoy's words sound like a condemnation, but also like a sign of salvation. Progress that cannot make human beings more human is not progress. It is only an illusion that blinds, a trick that hides the abyss.